I'm going to start with chapter 1, interestingly, verses 16 and 17, because they are the foundational verses of this entire epistle. You know, when Paul wrote this letter, he didn't figure that people would be reading it at, 43 consecutive seatings. He assumed they'd be reading it in one seating. And in any case, so we'll go back to that foundational verse, and then I'm going to read excerpts from chapters 3 and 4. I'm going to be trying to remove language about circumcision from this, because that's always confusing with Paul. When it turns up, it's just a question of whether or not it's Jewish people or non-Jewish people. But it's not the point of the sermon. That's why I'm sort of removing it. But would you listen for the Spirit of God as it brings a word to you from this text? For I, Paul, am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who is faithful, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faithfulness into faithfulness. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. For we hold that a person is justified by faith apart from works prescribed by law. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of course, the Gentiles also, since God is one, and he will justify and make right the circumcised on the ground of faithfulness and the uncircumcised on the ground of that same faithfulness. What then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our ancestor, according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to talk about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham trusted God, and that was reckoned to him as righteousness. For the promise that he would inherit the world did not come to Abraham or to his descendants through the law, but through the righteousness of faithfulness. If it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings about wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there violation. For this reason, it depends upon faithfulness, in order that the promise may rest upon grace and be guaranteed to all Abraham's descendants, not only to the adherents of the law, but also to those who share the faith of Abraham. For he is the father of all of us, as it is written, I've made you the father of many nations. In the presence of God, in whom Abraham believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Hoping against hope, Abraham believed that he would become the father of many nations, according to what was said, so numerous shall your descendants be. He did not weaken in trusting when he considers his own body, which was already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust made him waver concerning the promises of God, but Abraham grew strong in his faithfulness. He gave glory to God, being fully convinced that God was able to do what God had promised. Therefore, his faithfulness was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, the words, it was reckoned to him, were written not for his sake alone, but for ours also. But I had a good friend named Tommy Ostberg when I was a little guy. I'm thinking this story comes from when we were about 10 years old. And Tommy is now an upstanding Presbyterian elder. I mean to tell you, he's rock solid right down the line. I think his church is leaving the denomination, but in any case, we're not holy enough. But when we were young, we used to go onto the Shakamaxon golf course. And sometimes we got chased off. It was a private golf course. In any case, one mischief night, night before Halloween, people go out and throw toilet paper around and soap windows and that sort of thing. So one mischief night, Tommy went out with a couple of guys and he dumped some mud on the greens of the Shakamaxon Country Club. Okay? Now, I didn't do that, okay? Because I couldn't find a way to get out of the house. But my mother asked him a couple of days later when we were on our way, I think it was to trampoline class, I forget, at the YMCA. My mother asked him, Tommy, why did you do that? And he explained, he says, well, it's funner to be bad than good. Interesting. Funner to be bad than good. And he was sort of caught up in a group of people that thought it would be fun to do that. I remember the afternoon when we were coming up with the plot or the plan, there was kind of a groupthink about it. That's what human beings are like, right? We do groupthink. We get ourselves going, get one another going as we go. I mean, that's why people are so excited about the Giants, right? It's groupthink. I mean, it's exciting what's happening with the Giants, all right? And people here, they feel, and you really don't have any choice about it. That's the interesting thing to me. You don't have any choice about the excitement you have, and I know that because I couldn't care less about the Giants. I'm always paying attention to the Yankees score. Ah, you see? See what groupthink does? It has you disrespecting another human being and his choices? Good heavens! That's the nature of groupthink, you know, and the thing is there are some things that are good about it. Right now, would you say that the groupthink in this congregation has got energy and flow and we're going somewhere? Last 3 or 4 weeks, I sense a real shift in the energy. And we've seen that before, the shift in energy where we feel rock solid, like we're really happening, but we've also seen shifts in energy that take us down, right? You know, that's the thing with groupthink. Takes us down, moves us up, and we don't have a great deal of choice about it. It's something we can't quite get our hands on. Sometimes it can be awful. I mean, the groupthink among human beings can really tear individuals down. Some of you know I have a dear friend, Rabbi Mark Goffney, who is certainly not a perfect man by any means, but there's been a kind of groupthink in the community around him that has absolutely torn him apart and torn him down. It's almost like there's no choice. People are caught up in it somehow. I think about what happened to Tiger Woods. I mean, okay, not the world's most moral human being, but there are worse. And I wonder, you know, what's going to happen to Lance. It seems to me as though not much, because people are sick and tired of the judgmental attitude of groupthink right now, so he may get a bye. But groupthink does have a way of controlling us, and sometimes it has horrible consequences. I mean, why is it that we're not paying any attention to our environment? It's like the groupthink has us ignoring it. Or when the drum starts to beat for war, why is it that we all manage to get caught up into the midst of it? And how about genocide? Oh, you know, we can talk about the Nazis and how they paid attention to Hitler and the Hutus, how awful that was, and we can identify those things. Do you know that historians can identify 43 genocides since 1490? 43 genocides. This is a human characteristic. It's not something that's isolated in a couple of spots. No, this is groupthink at its worst. Binding us up, tearing us down. It causes tremendous fear because we don't have much choice in the middle of it. I mean, do you think that all the folks in Germany that somehow managed to support the Third Reich would have said a decade before that they were going to support that kind of behavior? Can't imagine it. There's a groupthink that takes over. Now, people describe it in different ways. They have all kinds of ideas as to how it is and why it is. So, you know, Carl Jung talked about a collective unconscious. There's sort of this flow that runs among us, and it affects our dreams, it affects how we think, it helps to form us as a human community, but that's part of what draws us together and has the shifting sands gather people up in one direction or another. The Vedas used to talk about the Akashic records many years ago. That's all the experiences of humankind, past, present, and future, sort of written large in the cosmos in a way that the patterns affect human life. as an explanation to understand why it is that human beings gather up in this group think and move from one place to another. There's a Harvard biologist, sociologist named Rupert Sheldrake who talks about morphic fields. The idea that people are caught up into a history or a community such that they are formed by it. Professors have talked about the fact in poetry classes, for instance, that years ago they would have to explain things about modernism. And somehow, without anything happening, the new students that come in, not having been in the class years before, seem to start at a more advanced knowledge than they had years ago. It's as though somehow they had been part of this field of education that they got drawn up into so very quickly. And the groupthink forming them and gathering them together. But when it's at its worst, it's horrible. Now, the Apostle Paul understands that there is a different field that we can be part of. Oh, I don't think he thinks about morphic fields. It seems to me as though all of those things, Akashic records or the consciousness that comes between all of us, that flow, or the morphic fields, they're all pointing towards something that we seem to know about. And Paul seems to think that there is another field that we can be drawn into. It's the field that is the generations or the offspring of Abraham. It's the people that are faithful to the presence of God. Now that first verse, excuse me, that first verse where he talks about through faith into faith, that's actually a very technical sentence. It's referring to a testament of inheritance. The Jews believed that one person could bequeath something to someone generations later. So you might leave property, but you'd leave it in such a way that the next 6 generations couldn't do anything with it, but the 7th generation could make some shifts. So there was a fidelity to this contract that would take place. And so the contract or the testament that came to Abraham was that because of his faithfulness to God, that the people that came from his seed, the people that went from his line, were caught up into an entirely different field than the world around. The problem was that in Abraham's family, that is to say the nation of Israel, they got caught up in this business of law. And because they got caught up in the business of law and tried to grip hold of what was right and what was wrong, they lost track of the love that was to form them in the midst of that law. And so this bequeathing or this testament, this willingness of God to give this tremendous promise to the people of Abraham's lineage was then completed in this testament of inheritance in the presence of Jesus of Nazareth from the faith or trust or faithfulness of Abraham into the faithfulness of Jesus the Christ. That's what Paul is after there. And that because Jesus was able to break through the barriers of ethnic cleansing or ethnic closing in, all of a sudden the world opened up. The entire promise of Abraham that it would be the whole world that would be formed in the presence and the love of God could take place. Now understand, from my point of view, this is a beautiful story told in the Scriptures. An idea that sets out before us that we can be a part of. I'm not going to claim it's the only way that one can break away from the groupthink of humanity. But I am going to claim that there is some truth in the midst of this because God has worked in the midst of those people. God has offered up the opportunity to be formed in a different way, to not live within the midst of the fear that drives to violence, the fear that creates economic disaster. The people of God, those that are faithful, are brought into this salvation, this place where they are not controlled by that groupthink, but rather are formed in the love of God. Those that are faithful, or I should say, as they are being faithful, they are brought in to this new field, this new family, this presence of God, shifting not only themselves, but the world around them. Not if they are faithful, but as they are being faithful, they are a part of that movement of God all throughout history that Paul's identifying. So in a world that desperately needs the hope that comes from God's love, in a world that needs to walk away from fear and into the presence of the hope of a God who always moves from death to new life, we are called to be God's faithful people. So how do we do that? Anybody have a bulletin? Jackie Astle made this logo a long time ago, and it seems like each time I look at it, it takes us one step deeper. Because we've thought about our ministry here in what I call 4 quadrants, 4 areas, call it what you want, but one of the areas that we look at is a spiritual path. How do you be faithful? How do you live out the faithfulness of God's love? You need to be spiritually formed. There is no way around it. That happens some at church, but it happens more if it's a daily practice. You know, the central daily practice of Christian faith. There's one preeminent daily practice of Christian faith, and that's an examination of your life in reference to the law of the love of God, to recognize where you fall short and where you need God's grace to help you grow every single day. Not to pull yourself down, but rather to be healed, to be lifted up, to form a community of faithfulness as we affect one another. In order to do that, of course, you have to have some sense of what the law of love might be, of what God's direction for you might be. And that's going to require the study. It's going to require an intelligible faith. It's going to have to make sense of the Scriptures, make sense of the hope that we have preached for thousands of years. In order to do that, it takes study, an effort, work, to pay attention to what it is you believe and what it means for the way you live your life. Of course, if we just look in on ourselves, this does not as much to form us as when we begin to open our hearts and serve the world around us. That's why we offer opportunities for service. Because you can meet God in the presence of the people who you are helping. Because your heart is opened up and your habits become that are generous as you share the love of God with others and begin to spread that field even further. Then, of course, that's that hard one we have, an accountable community. What's that? That's a group of people that all know that they are here to be developed as faithful people of God. That as they are faithful, they will be a part of God's work, God's field, God's effort to break people free of the fear that leads to violence and chaos. And so we have a community that stands with people, that recognizes that each of us falls short, that is interested in challenging one another to greater growth in faith. That in the midst of the struggles and the difficulties that we have together, we recognize what God is doing and how God would have us grow and change. This is what it means to be a faithful community. And as we are faithful, we form this field that blows away the giants every time. I mean, it's the activity of God that works in the world. We are called to be a faithful community because when we are, it makes a difference. People are afraid. They need to know that there is nothing to fear because God's love will always move them from the place where they are in bondage to a place of freedom, from a place where they feel they are exiled from their home to a place where they feel they are in the warmth of their mother's arms, from a place of death to a place of new life. It has always been so for the people seeking to be faithful to the presence of God. It's our call. It is not funner to be bad than good. Tommy and I were caught up in a field of belief that were leading us into a place that was somewhat miserable. You would not believe how much work Tom's father made him do. It's not funner to be bad than good. It's funner to be formed in the presence of God, to live out a life of faithfulness, to be part of the tradition and the family of Abraham, carried through the love of Jesus Christ, all the way to one another and into the world beyond.